Welcome to the Northern Light RC channel, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Now, if you're already a subscriber, good to see you again. If you're new, please subscribe and we'll have some fun in the future. Today I'm taking you through a complete change of bearings on the Traxxas Slash 4x4. Now, bearings are quite essential to keeping your Slash rolling, so maintenance is pretty important. You don't want them blowing out, giving extra tension to the motor or to any other part of the drive chain. A couple of weeks ago, spring finally arrived to Norway, this isolated outpost at the northern end of Europe, and we could finally take our Slash outside and have some fun. Me and my stepdaughters, we've had some pretty good sessions. We've been running in a nearby forest, running in mud and grass and water, and we've had it on the beach where we've taken it through sand and salt water. So I figured it's about time to do something to the bearings. So I will just change all the bearings on this Traxxas. Now, before I go to work on this bearing change, I would like to give you some pointers. There are some great resources to be found at traxxas.com. Now, if you go to that page and hit the model showroom and select your model, you will find a link there called support, where you can find all sorts of helpful documents like setup sheets, parts lists and exploded views. Now, exploded views are your friend, so save it and print it out and have it in your toolbox. I always do that, and there you can see everything what's going on. So if you want to identify which bearings you're going to get for this change, then go to the exploded views and you can see all the things going on there. Now let's have a look at the front assembly. Here you can see that we have two bearings on the steering blocks and two bearings on the differential, and also two bearings going out to the center drive shaft. We also have four bearings on the steering bell crank. Moving on to the rear assembly, we have two bearings on each axle carrier, and we have two bearings on the differentials, and we have one bearing on the diff box. Moving on to the transmission assembly, you can see that there's one bearing for the motor mount, and if you have the slipper clutch installed, there's also a bearing there. Now, bear in mind, if you've done upgrades on your truck, then there might be some different sizes for bearings. For example, if you have the King Head's motor mount, then there's a bigger bearing there. And if you have the Techno axles, then there's also a bigger bearing for the steering blocks and the axle carriers. Now, I've gone ahead and done all the work for you guys. So if you go down to the description, you will find a complete list of all the bearings that you will need. Also, I put in some variations for the Techno drive shafts and for the King Head's motor mount. So, which bearings are you gonna get? There's a lot of brands out there, and also you have to choose if you want to go ceramic or steel ball. Now, the ceramic ones are quite expensive, and I tend to think that if I just buy some cheap but reliable bearings, I can change them out once a year or so, and it will not cost me that much. Now, I've chosen to go for Avid RC bearings for all my RCs, and I think they got some really good products, some good prices, and really good customer support. And for us living up north, outside of everything, we also have fast shipping for the Avid. So I can strongly recommend those products. If you go to avidrc.com, you can choose to buy a kit for your Slash and a lot of other RCs, or you can go pick out whatever you need. Remember that in our case we want to go for the metric ones. Now, Avid has several different types of bearings that you can choose from. You have the revolutions, you have rubber, you have metal, you have ceramic revolution, and you have ceramic metal. I'm not going for ceramic in this case, so we have three options. We have the revolutions, the rubber and the metal. And all these descriptions talk about the sidewalls of the bearing. Now the metal ones are the one with least friction, but they're not sealed, so water and mud will come into it and pretty much destroy it real fast. Now the rubber ones are rubber sealed at the sides, so no water but a little more friction. Now the Revolutions, they have one side with rubber seal and one side with metal. So, well, it's a hybrid, more like a hybrid. And I've chosen to go for that for the most. Then you can put the seal outside, facing outside, and the metal facing inward. Now one of the reasons why I love Avid so much is they come so neatly packed, the packages. In small zip bags with a great sticker sheet. I have a lot of these now. And all the bearings come with great explanations to what they are. And some of them come in plastic tubes, which are handy, which I always save for later. Now, since this is going into a basher, I want to protect it a little bit against water getting into the bearings. I use silicone spray and I give them a little bit of a coating. Now, before I start working on my trucks, I always clean up the truck first, so that the job is less messy. So what I did here, this one was really muddy and it looked terrible. So I just threw it in the shower, gave it a good rinse, and then I used my air compressor to dry it out and also to get all the sand out of these difficult corners and everything. And I also cleaned my tires, just doing it in the sink with some soap, some dish soap, and let them dry off, so they're good to go. So I have removed the lid and the wheels to make everything more accessible. Now there's two bearings on each steering block, so we'll start with that. So we start by removing the wheel hexes. Now on the stock wheel hex you can just pop it right off. I have the MIP, so I need to unscrew it first. Then I'll just pop these off. Then I'm going to remove this screw to release the caster link. And when the caster link is released, we can push out these whole parts. Now you will find one bearing on the outside and one on the inside. You can use a screwdriver or something to get it out. Now I'm just going to clean out the inside before I put in the new one. Now when putting in the new one, you need to apply the same pressure on all sides so that the bearing will seat itself properly. I have this tool to help me for that. So make sure the bearing is all the way in and properly placed. And then we put in the front one, the outside one. And again, I will use my handy little tool just to get it properly situated. Then I can put the axle back in and connect it to the piece that goes in to the diff, and put the caster link back. Now I'm going to use some blue thread lock since this is going into metal, just to make sure that it doesn't unscrew itself once driving. So I screw this back in, and then I can put the wheel hex back in place. Now on the stock one you will have a pin that goes into here so that the wheel hex will snap into that place. But in my case I just have to screw it back in. So once you have done the right side, just as we did the left side front, then we move on to the rear. And here is exactly the same thing going on. We need to remove the hex and also the caster link. So then we can remove the axle, and here the bearing came with, and we can pop the other one out from the back side. I will just clean it up a little bit and insert new ones. So then we put the axle back inside, connect it with the other end of the axle, and we reattach the caster link. Now I will use Loctite on this one. Then I put the hex back on and secure it. Right, that's it. Then I will repeat that process on the other side. Okay, so now we've done all 4 corners. So let's move on to the rear assembly and to the slipper clutch and motor mount. Okay, so to remove the rear assembly, you have to unscrew 4 screws, which is these 2 on top and these 2 at the bottom of the truck. Then we can remove the rear assembly. Oh, there's some sand. And set the rear assembly aside. And then we can simply pull out the slipper clutch and set that aside. So here you can see that I have the King Head's motor mount, which has a bigger bearing than the stock, but it's the same principle. So you simply poke the bearing out from the inside. So before I put in a new bearing, I will just clean this area out. And then we'll put in a new bearing. There we go. So then we're moving on to the slipper clutch, and here you have to remove this whole part and you have to unscrew this to get into where the bearing is inside, just right here. So we'll start by undoing this one, and then we undo the spring. Then we remove the nut, the spring, and this one, and then we can see the bearing. Now we can take out this whole shaft for the slipper, and we just poke out the bearing like that. Now I'm going to use a Q-tip just to get out all the sand before I insert a new bearing. And then we insert the new bearing. We put the shaft back in place. We put this thing here, the spring, and the nut. I'm going to tighten the nut all the way in and then loosen 1/4, because that's how I like my slipper clutch setup. So all the way in and loosen by 1/4. So then it's time to put this piece back, and I'm going to loosen the set screw all the way out and put on some thread lock. And then we put it back in place and tighten. Right, so then the slipper clutch is ready. Right, so then we can start working on the rear assembly. Now, first of all, we need to remove the rear bumper, and we'll start with the sway bars if you have those installed. So that's these 2 screws, and then we'll continue by these 2 screws, and at the bottom we'll unloosen these 2 screws. Right, so then we can just remove the rear bumper and set that aside. So now we almost have access to the rear differential, and we need to remove the end plate with this screw and also these 2 screws before we can remove the diff box lid. I'm just going to leave the hinge pins in there so the A-arms can stay. So then we can remove the diff box lid. Now just pull the diff out, and you can see both the bearings that we are changing. Now we can set the differential away for a little bit and focus on the bearing that's inside the diff box. Now you can just simply poke it from the back side, and it should just pop out together with this gear. But as you see, there's a bearing connected to this gear. So we put the new bearing onto the gear, and I'm going to put the yellow side, which is the sealed side, in the opposite way to the gear so that this one is facing out and can withstand some water. And then we'll just pop the bearing and gear back into where it's supposed to sit. And we can set the rear assembly aside. Now we need to loosen the drive shafts to get to the bearings. And on the stock one, you have one set screw. Now I have the MIP heavy duties, so I have 2 set screws. And I'll just undo those. Right, so then we can remove the old bearings and put on the new ones. Rubber seals outside. Now since I have the MIP axles, I will use thread lock on the set screws. So before we put the diff back into the diff box, I'm just going to apply some fresh moly grease onto the main gear. So then we can put the diff back into the diff box, and there's only one way this will fit because the bearings have different sizes. And before you put them into the diff box, then reattach the axles. And then we can put the lid back on. And then we put the end plate back in place. We put in the end plate screw and the 2 last screws to secure the diff box. So then we can put the bumper back in place. Then we fasten the 2 screws from the top. Then we put the sway bar in its place and fasten with the 2 screws. And then we turn it upside down and fasten the 2 last screws for the bumper. So then we can put the slipper clutch back in, and we'll make sure that this part here goes correctly into the center drive shaft. And then we can put the rear assembly back. And then we'll fasten the rear assembly to the chassis by putting in 2 screws here and 2 screws here. So then the rear assembly is finished and we can move on to the front assembly. Now let's separate the front assembly from the chassis. And we'll start by removing these 2 screws that holds the sway bar, and these 2 screws and these 2 screws. Then the front assembly will come loose, only attached by the servo arm. Now loosen the servo arm by unscrewing this screw. And the front assembly is free. So then we can set the chassis aside again and focus on the front assembly. So we'll start off by removing the bumper. And we start with those 2 screws and these 3 screws here. Right, so then we remove the front bumper and set aside. So just like with the rear assembly, we are now removing the end plate with this screw, and these 2 screws here will loosen up the diff box lid. So then we can remove the diff box lid, and here's the diff. The difference between the front and rear differential is that this one is blocked by the shocks, so you would have to remove the set screws on the axles to get it out. So we'll do that. So then we just pull the axles away from the diff, and the diff is free. Now we'll just remove the old bearings and replace with new ones. I'll just remove a little bit of the old moly grease and apply some new fresh moly grease. So back to the front assembly. Inside this part of the diff box sits one bearing on the outside and one bearing from the inside. And to access that, we need to remove this drive shaft output. And there's a little set screw here. And this set screw goes all the way through like this. So we set this aside for a minute, and then we can push this one and remove it from the inside of the diff box. Now from the inside you should be able to just pop out the bearing, and we do the same for the inner bearing. Then I'll put the bearing from the inside first, and then the outside one. Now before we put the gear and the drive shaft output back in place, we can change the 4 bearings that are situated on the steering bell cranks. And you remove these by removing these 2 screws. Now remember, there is also a washer here, so take care of that one. Then the steering bell crank should be easy to pop off the steering posts. Now there's 2 bearings on the top and 2 on the bottom, and usually one of them is stuck here. So then you should get those out by carefully using some pliers. Now I'm not going to change out these 4 bearings because I recently did that once I installed this aluminum steering bell crank from Hot Racing. So you just change these 4 out and you put the steering bell crank back into the steering posts. And then we screw in the screw with the washer, and the steering bell crank is done. Now we can take this gear and put it back from the inside and put on the axle output and apply some thread lock to the set screw and secure it. So then it's time to put the diff back into the diff box. And just like with the rear one, there is only one direction that will actually fit. And then we reattach the axles and put back the set screws, and I will apply thread lock to those. So make sure that the diff is properly seated, and we can put back the diff box lid. So then we put the end plate back on, secure it with the end plate screw and the 2 screws up here to secure the diff box. So then we reassemble the front bumper and secure it by these 2 screws here on top and these 3 screws at the bottom. So now the front assembly is ready. Now because I have the RPM front bulkhead, I can make it easier to connect the whole thing to the chassis by dividing the bulkhead into 2 pieces. So I'll do that by removing these 3 screws. Just like that. So since I have an aluminum servo horn, I will apply some thread lock before I mount the servo arm to the servo horn. And then first of all I need to have the center drive line in place, and then the first part of the bulkhead, making sure that the steering bell crank is properly seated. And then I will fasten this one with the 2 screws, one here and one here. And then I put the rest of the bulkhead and front assembly in place, and I will secure it with the 2 screws here on top. And while I'm at it, I will secure the sway bars by these 2 screws. So all that's left now is to fasten the last 3 screws on the RPM front bulkhead. Just like that. Well guys, there you have it. That's it. We are done with the complete bearing change. Now bear in mind that we didn't change the 2 bearings that are in the motor. That's another tutorial. But this basher is now ready to go bashing again. So let's get the lid and the wheels back on it. Bam! Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you had a good time together with me, and that we can spend some more time together in the future. Now please leave a comment below, subscribe and like. So until next time, see ya.